Nice to see you all. As mentioned, I've been with the Smart Cities Council for, I think, the better part of 8 years as a partner and a sponsor. And just talking to Connie a few moments ago, I remember that Johnson Controls, we were part of the Smart Cities certification. Who took that Smart City certification? Did anyone in the audience? All right, I like to see it. I don't know how many municipal leaders we have, but there was a lot, right, Connie? So the word for the Smart Cities Council and for all of you wonderful partners is definitely getting out there. May the 9th, I will have been with Johnson Controls for 20 years. I can't believe I actually said that out loud. So it's been a fantastic place, and I've been really fortunate to work in the smart city space. Probably kind of kicked off the smart city space about 12 years ago with Johnson Controls, just for the greedy reason of trying to figure out how any of our products and services and solutions could apply to the space. I got a lot of pushback back then. A lot of people said, we don't know if we believe that there is such a thing as smart cities, right? So I would consider myself and everyone in this room to be warriors in the secure, connected, and resilient community space, because it's not something that everybody agrees to. There are definitely different sides from a political standpoint and adoption, and so I welcome everybody and all their questions, and hopefully this is a really good dialogue. So I thought I'd hit some of the here and now. For those of you who have heard me speak before, I like to kind of set the stage with municipal challenges that our city and our suburbs and our county leaders are dealing with, and I update them like every 3 months or so just by listening. The other good part about my job is that I get to spend a lot of time with customers, and so I'm consistently checking with terms and with tones, with the narrative, to make sure that we are right, on target, and understand the current needs and the issues they're dealing with. Chris did a great job talking about an overview of the packages this morning, and then he really dug deep into IRA, so I won't be spending a lot of time with that. But what I do want to share with you, and I'll be happy to share these slides with anyone who is interested in them, is the different ways that the different funds are being tracked. I lead the National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors relationship for JCI too, so I'm constantly asking what they're doing to track these funds, and they work with people such as Bloomberg Philanthropies and other entities, so they've got some great trackers, and I'm happy to share those as well. Some of the funds adoption, Chris mentioned a little bit about what the funds were, but we have some examples of where they've been adopted, and I have some maps for specific funds that are out there, and I'll show you how to find them on your own because they're constantly being updated. The flow, really important, in the potential milestones. And I think someone said the word pressure, but I think it's an urgency that we really help ourselves and our individual companies, as well as our partners and the ecosystem partners that we engage and pursue customers with, to really put that urgency in place, because some of these funds are to the point where they're about to expire. Others are kind of in their early infancy, but when we have certain milestones that are coming up, there might be a shift. And then I thought I'd just wrap it up by talking about sustainable practices, and I think that that's been a conversation today, so I think that a lot of it's going to be an overview. So municipal challenges. So last year I spoke more about the recovery effort and getting people back into the buildings, and constantly mayors and county commissioners and city managers, as well as also governors, wanted to get citizens and constituents and business owners back into the building. I think Dr. Gray had mentioned that too. And it was about confidence and coming in and getting the seniors back into community centers, getting families to start using the libraries again, getting citizens to come in and do their civic responsibility and be in there and take jury. I know we all love jury duty so very much, right? But I just had an opportunity to be in a court the other day where the judge was dealing with people in front of him. He had people on the webcam. It was a train wreck. It was just crazy. He did a really nice job, but there was so much coming at him and people not knowing how to use Zoom, et cetera. So this, it's a new challenge that we have. So it's more about that retention and confidence. And what I mean by retention, and that's the word that I hear from these customers and from these leaders, is they talk about competing more than ever before. And a lot of that has to do with the new lifestyles that we have. And not just competing with the cities and the counties that are next door, but cities and counties that are 3,000 miles away, because we have so many new choices and so many new demands. So that need for the adaptive, right? It's the work and the live and the play and all that technology adoption that's actually happening because of these hybrid lives we're starting to live. I'm always on a plane, much to the dismay of my family, although they do like the points and the Marriott points that I actually provide to them when they want upgrades, or my children want to go somewhere warm with their significant others and they ask for my points. But I was on the plane a couple weeks ago where I was sitting next to someone who actually lived in San Francisco and worked in Paris, and that was not a big deal. And someone else who was in San Antonio who I think worked in New York. This is the world. I think they're calling them super commuters these days. I think I saw that in the Wall Street Journal. Like, you're not just commuting a couple hours or a drive, you're actually commuting across time zones. I find it fascinating, but that is really challenging / freaking a lot of municipal leaders out to say, what do I do to make sure that my city or my town or whatever my patch of dirt is the place where people want to come and live and thrive and raise their families. So there's a whole new need to brand themselves differently and really invest in order for them to continue to be those destination type of cities. Urban core renewal and space reutilization. We saw this a lot during the pandemic. I don't know if I'm a New Yorker. I loved the fact that all the restaurants came out into the streets. Not many people, like Uber drivers or taxi drivers, really enjoyed that, and different cities did that. But just taking those different places and spilling out into the city and reutilizing, creating people areas, people movement areas, where many streets closed down across the country, and they started creating these outdoor zones for people to be able to sit and listen to music, et cetera. So that reutilization is interesting, and it changes the way that infrastructure is used. It changes the way that technology is adopted and the way that people are using that. So that's a big piece. Revitalization and, excuse me, building performance standards are another topic that I'm constantly looking at. I think that Chris Castro also mentioned that too. These building performance standards, and not just the well buildings, but all the things that are being committed to publicly by municipal leaders, by state leaders, and the consequences that are actually starting to, I don't know, Albie, you were in New York. I think that New York is pretty famous for early adopting of those BPSs, and also having negative consequences, punitive consequences that are there. If you do not build towards these certain standards, we will ding you in certain ways. So, I mean, that's something that is very, very interesting, and do stay tuned, because that's going to be a much bigger issue as we move forward, the building performance standards. I know that a lot of mayors are committing to those BPSs for their cities, but right now it's more for their private developers, not so much for their government building stock. So stay tuned, because that has that whole climate resiliency and ESG wrapped around it. It's very interesting. Communications, we saw this before during the pandemic, and it's now evolved in terms of being able to get information out real time from a public safety standpoint, or just community communication. And so this is something now that we're all very used to, and we like that we can hear directly from our leaders and don't have to make a phone call or stop in and do permits with papers, et cetera, and people are getting used to that. And then the next set of public safety and growth needs. We talked about that growth and investment, but public safety, I mean, good Lord, every day you get onto your computer or you wake up and read your newspaper and some other tragedy has happened. So the challenge is that a lot of people seem to be very angry right now, and if it's not the economy or it's not their general state of well-being, there's a lot more violence, or at least it seems like there's a lot more violence. We're finding out more about that. So leaders are trying to consistently figure out where are the places that they're going to invest in order to make sure that their city is seen as a safe place to be. And then the word sustainable, it really depends. I have been evolving in my role to now working with governors, and I will say when we speak with them, It's a much more political conversation than when you're at the mayoral level, and you have to watch your terms when you're with one side or the other side. Some of them, at the end of the day, it's always about economic development and vibrancy, job creation, et cetera. Some of them want to talk about sustainability. Some of them don't want to talk about sustainability, and you have the same conversation, but you tag it towards more of that economic development piece and resiliency. And that's where it always has to eventually hit. So I thought I'd just do a quick overview of the major federal packages. I think the first couple from the CARES Act, et cetera, that was more about recovery, getting us back in the buildings and kind of filling in those holes, right? So there was pension gaps, there was permitting gaps, people had been furloughed and were brought back. And I'll be happy to share these slides with you so you don't have to take a picture of them. But CARES was important, and although CARES only went to 36 cities and counties across the entire country. It had to be a certain demographic, so a lot of people got left behind. Now, these are just the major packages. There are so many in terms of various ones that are underneath. I'm gonna go to ARPA, though, the American Rescue Plan Act, because that was more, okay, we're back, we're recovering now, and let's move forward in a certain way. The BIL, or the IIJA, because they didn't want to make it confusing enough, and they gave it 2 names, and so that was very interesting. Just go back to ARPA. ARPA is money that went directly into the bank accounts of cities and towns and villages and counties and states all over the country. It was done in 2 tranches, if we know, and it's the first tranche, and then a year later the second tranche, and that is the thing that the National League of Cities is still focusing on, how those funds are being utilized, how they're being invested, and what the impact is for their individual communities. So that's something we'll get a little bit more deeper into, and it's really the only one that they're truly tracking at this point. But the BIL, the Jobs Act, and then the Inflation Reduction Act, we'll go into this a little bit more. The BIL is more about, at the end of the day, there's a lot of money that came out, but it's more about transportation, roads and bridges, and if you're in your own towns and it's taking you twice as long to get everyone everywhere, and there's cones everywhere, and that's your BIL dollars working, I think, and all your leaders are definitely spending those dollars. So the bottom area, which we thought was very interesting, as they evolved, the dollars related to focus was more about verticals, and as you move from CARES, you could see the different focus areas: energy infrastructure and public transportation and roads and bridges and clean drinking water. Water was a big deal, rural broadband was a big deal, and there was a huge spotlights that were shown on gaps that we had in the municipal space. And so on a silver lining standpoint, and if whoever in this room, if you had tragedies in your family, then I'm so sorry, and I'm not trying to make light of this, but there was some real beauty that came out of the pandemic for municipal leaders and people, in general, because we realized where there were glaring gaps in infrastructure, in deferred maintenance, in services that were required. And so these dollars and that influence really actually changed it. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which is even more detailed, and when I talk about it, I'm going to talk about that $369 billion. That is for that clean, renewable energy. So the Bipartisan Act, we talked about it more about transportation than anything else, and a little bit about broadband and about clean water, et cetera, and then the power infrastructure. So this is an interesting slide, but this one is even better. It's how the funds were flowing. And wow, they couldn't make it any more vague or confusing for so many of our partners and so many of our customers, how the money was coming. Was it competitive or non-competitive? Was it a grant? Was it a direct allocation? Every single fund was different. And so there was a lot of questions. I don't know if any of you were on those White House IGA calls, the Intergovernmental Affairs call. They would have them on a weekly basis. 5,000 mayors would call in. I remember once 5,000 mayors called, and I think the Zoom link broke because there were so many people calling saying, I need information. And it was mostly the small towns and villages. It wasn't the big cities like LA and Miami and Chicago, New York. They're the ones that actually help structure these funds and how they were written. It was the smaller municipalities and counties that didn't want to be seen as misappropriating funds, so they wanted to be so careful on what the allowable uses were, what the guidance was, and how they were going to be spending. And a lot of them to this day still haven't spent all their DARPA funds. So keep in mind, if you're actually still looking to get projects funded and you're helping, with services and with products and solutions, there's still money that's out there. But this money, it went through the Department of Transportation. This took a lot of detective work to try to figure this out, and we worked with teams and our lobbyists and everyone else, but this was basically it in terms of how the money flowed, how the different organizations, because we know government departments all work together so beautifully and they all talk together so lovely, right? So I was on the phone with us, right, with the state energy office, because we were also speaking with all the state energy office officials, and one said, all this money that's coming out for energy security and energy efficiency, half of it went to the DOT in my state, and they don't talk to us. So they were looking to create an overall dashboard of the impact that these funds were making across their state, and they only had 50% of the picture. I won't go into detail. This is just a quick one. Chris did a beautiful job in talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and quite frankly, it's still not out there, right? There is some work being done in the federal space. There is work being done with those tax credits, but there's still guidance that's needed on the IRA. And we're looking at that $369 billion in terms of the energy security and climate change. That's what our focus is in terms of figuring out a little bit more and how we can help our customers utilize that and acquire it. So I like this slide. This is something that I just created the other day, the movement of funds, because the reason why, because we constantly have those Gantt charts, right, that are showing here's the fund, this is what the allowable uses are, this is how it's happening. But when they start, when they expire, and then looking at the big blue thing in the middle, which is quite an interesting milestone, this is not to put any type of threat or fear in you all. It's more about that urgency that I started off with. It's time. If these people are frozen or stuck or are stalled in terms of moving ahead with doing these competitive grant applications, going out and actually utilizing these dollars, that blue square could really change depending on what the outcome is if the dollars are going to remain. People love to say, oh, the dollars are going to be there for 10 years for the IRA. Are they? Are they going to still be there? We don't know. So this is like a call for urgency, and the word pressure can sometimes be seen as negative, so I don't know if you'd like to use that with customers or with your partners, but just urgency and start doing those improvements now, because we never know what the future holds. So here's that tracker that I mentioned, the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act tracker, and it's done through, I think it's Brookings Institute and the National League of Cities. And I don't know if I have the link here, but I will be happy to share that link with whoever gets in touch with me, or you can get in touch with Connie, et cetera. But here's an example. I love this. I was just down at the Congressional City Conference about 3 weeks ago, down here in DC with the National League of Cities. It was their winter conference, and they were going into this. And I had raised my hand and said, where's the BIL tracker? And they were like, girl, we're not doing that yet because it's not even time. But ARPA, they're really focusing. And again, these are the dollars that flowed directly into their bank accounts. They didn't have to really do anything. They didn't have to do submittals. I don't know if any of you have been part of this whole Renew America for Schools proposals that are going in. I think they were just due on the 17th. So much work. We have a huge grants department in our company, and so we're constantly helping customers with filling out these grants and figuring them out and figuring out what the criteria is. These dollars just flowed. They didn't have to do anything. So this tracker is actually interesting because you can go in. I think I pulled up City of Boston because the person who was helping me with my slides was from Boston, so, wanted to help out. He's still here. Great, cool. 331 governments are being covered. 11,000 projects are in here. So if you want to take a look and see these, there's some really beautiful work that's going on. The majority of this work was done, as you can see, 40% was government operations. Community aid, 11% was infrastructure. We're hoping that that number goes up. Public health, as well as some public safety. And then at the end of the day, I'm hoping that that workforce development number of 8.5% really goes up. I just spoke at the National Association of State Energy Officials, and the whole thing was about workforce development and enhancement and uplifting the community their individual communities so that they were prepared for the employment of the future. And that's a huge piece. I will say that the DOE and their respective colleagues are looking that any work that's being done in the energy efficiency space should have some type of work development wrapper around that. And if that's to just lifting up local labor force, if it's creating training programs and STEM programs for K through 12, it's about creating programs for recidivism in particular prisons where you actually are helping lift them up because they're part of your community too. Nobody's left behind. That's why I love this everyone logo and brand that Corey's created with his team at the Smart Cities Council, because it really needs to be everyone. Because if it's not everyone, then we are not sustainable, and neighborhoods are not sustainable, because that's a big piece of it, lifting people up. So this is the ARPA piece. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, this is another piece, and Cole, my colleague in the back, if I mess this up, you can, because he helped me with these as well, but this is some of the work that's being done. Again, the two call-outs is most of these dollars are Department of Transportation funded, so if you can see, a lot of these are examples of projects that have been flowing. And so the interesting part, there's a lot of clean energy work. And what's that dollar amount? What is it? It's $22 million. Sorry, I have horrible eyes. But the funding allocation over here is very interesting. And you can see at the end of the day, people are starting to utilize these funds, which is fantastic. But there's always a challenge, right? And a lot of it is that we got a little ahead of our skis when the government announced some of these funds and they were not available, right? Some of it was done for political reasons. Remember how we saw a lot of it coming out during the midterm elections, and then nothing, right? So there was a lag. So with all of that excitement and the energy of actually getting these dollars or finding out about them and learning about what they could be used for, a lot of these areas, when we say K through 12 and in colleges and state and local airports, et cetera, the announcement was there and then there were no dollars, or there was no clear allowable uses or guidance that was provided. And so it really stalled a lot of people. It probably stalled a lot of projects too, because we were getting feedback that a lot of municipal leaders were excited about utilizing these funds to fund infrastructure projects that they hadn't been able to afford, right? And there was all this alternative funding that was out there, but at the end of the day, they couldn't take on the debt. So I think Chris, this morning, Castro made a comment about capital stacking, and I think that's really great advice, where you can actually take and braid and blend these different funds. They don't have to be by themselves. Some of them are actually quite small. The EECBG competitive grants that just came out, I think it was last month, they're very, very tiny. So it's not going to be something that can pay for an entire project to bring an outcome, an overall impact to the community, but it's probably more of like a catalyst for something where you can actually use those dollars to kind of get people moving forward and thinking in the right direction. The BIL and IRA, as we mentioned, they reacted quickly, and now it's kind of, sitting there. And then, as we mentioned before, the impending potential blue square and how that might actually affect is making people revisit how they're going to spend these dollars and if they are at all. So we just talked about funding. We just talked about the use of funding and the tracking and funding and hopefully the impact that it's making in communities around the country. And I thought I'd just put a little bit in here about the road to sustainability, I should say, / resiliency, because that was another one of those definitions where people were interchanging, I guess, using those two terms in a way that I think was a little vague. And so after hearing folks for a few years use the word resiliency, use the word sustainability kind of interchangeable, we went out, I specifically and my team went out and we spoke to about 300 different county commissioners, mayors, and city managers. We talked to some sustainability directors too, although we had to pull them out because we thought that it was a little bit too close to home. But we wanted to ask them how they defined what sustainability was. And I thought it was really interesting. This was last year, it was down in September, so we probably do need to do an update now based on all the information. You can't swing a cat without seeing the word sustainable, right, on the news or in the paper or whatever, or resiliency, and what does that mean? That's why I did the little speed round, although not everybody cooperated with the one word, but I think we got the information that we needed. Scott did. He did. Thank you, Scott. But it was interesting because the respondents broke down sustainability into two areas. It was they considered sustainability and social sustainability, which I thought was very interesting. The economic health of their individual neighborhoods, or I would say communities, the innovation, climate measures that were started, that was more sustainable. When you asked them, they were like, oh, the green stuff. And we're like, okay, why don't you define what that means? Social sustainability was more about homelessness and childcare. It was about social equity. It was about making that impact and changing. It was about that Justice 40 that we talked about a little bit before. So then I said, I'm hearing the word resiliency more than sustainability when we speak with city and county leaders. What does that mean to you? And I think this is where kind of we all land, which is they considered it economic vibrancy and development. Anything that helps my city thrive more, that allows me to help attract and retain more citizens, constituents, and business owners. Pandemic and crisis response, okay, well, of course they're going to say that. We just came out of a horrible pandemic, right? And nobody was ready for that, and they want to be able to prepare themselves to be ready at that point. Predictive analytics, I think that was mentioned possibly earlier today with the systems and the way that your buildings are talking and that they're analyzing and all the data points and the interoperability and the ability to actually prepare and utilize their assets in a more functional and effective way, and to know what's coming. Building automation systems are great examples of that. They allow you to know when there's faults and when there's other things that are happening. They can tell you when it's a false alarm in the fire and safety space, so you're not constantly utilizing assets like police and fire to go out for false alarms, right? So they can be reutilized in another area. Microgrid investment. Microgrids is another word, Albie. Maybe we want to do a little podcast on what a microgrid is, because that's another thing that you're like, well, everybody talks about it so differently. I like that they're talking about it at all. But going and investing in a microgrid. I spend a fair amount of time in Puerto Rico every month, and the government is doing a phenomenal job down there preparing themselves to get ready. But if you are a praying person, I want you to keep the territory of Puerto Rico in your prayers, because they are consistently hit by hurricane, storm, earthquake, pandemic. It's just endless with them. And their energy grid is always kind of teetering on the brink of disaster. So being able to put things in place like microgrids so that the airport continues to function, that critical systems in hospitals continue to move forward, and that you don't have any life-saving, requirements that are not being met. So microgrids are definitely seen as creating my own island in my own town, so if everything else kind of goes to pot, I can actually keep my systems going and take care of my people. And then we talked a little bit about workforce development. I get the chance to work with the World Economic Forum, and they're phenomenal in terms of just data that they provide and think tanks and stuff. So this is a really interesting space where they actually created a toolbox of solutions for reducing carbon. This is something you might want to take a look at from Smart Cities World. And then this decarbonization agenda, I'm not going to go into detail with this, but I think we kind of touched upon it today, but not completely in terms of climate and in terms of what that means and in terms of how you're going to get there and different commitments that public entities are actually making and publicizing, and then their ability to get there. Chris mentioned this morning something about the DOE talked about, 50% of GHG reduction, greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. That's pretty aggressive, and that's amazing that they're doing it. But once you throw that number out there, and a lot of mayors signed that mayor compact, other leaders signed the Paris Accords, once that number's out there, and you think 2040 or 2050 is a long time, there's all these tiny little steps, and you need to get there. And there's people that are coming to us. I just had a meeting with a large city the other day, and they said, boy, we're behind. We're never going to make it. I'm like, what are you going to do? And they're like, well, we might have to reestablish our goals. And I was like, oh, So once they're out there with their their public statement. This is a big deal. And as we know, government is never the first to adopt. Even the early adopters who say they want to be first, they really want to be sixth or seventh because they want to see how other people are doing it, and they're working with our dollars, right? So they're being responsible. So we like that. But everyone knows that buildings emit more carbon. I think it's 40% of the carbon emissions that are out there are coming from buildings. So if we're building the buildings right and we're retrofitting them with the right systems, then we're actually doing our duty, I guess, as good global citizens to leave the earth for, the next generation. My daughter is at Virginia Tech, and she's in the School of Architecture, but within the built environment, she's studying environmental policy and planning. And she called me the other day, and she told me my carbon footprint stinks because I fly too much. I was like, well, not all of us can be on one of those, Paul Blart Segways or something, and I would love to. But she's right? So I try to do things like recycle and compost and, I don't know, wear the same shoes for 20 years, just so I'm kind of off-balancing my flying thing. But it's something for us to all think about. And I don't know about you, but I'm going to take the well building certification to just figure out how I can actually, and there's plenty of companies that are out there right now that are creating programs so that we all as individuals can actually figure out what our individual carbon footprint is, and then how we can actually do better. I'm seeing it done in schools and in different communities, so that's really exciting. And this is my last slide. This is the decarbonization journey. Setting goals, and I think that's been said a couple of times. You have to have a vision, you have to have goals. Make them realistic. You want to make them a little assertive and aggressive, but you don't want to make them so far-reaching that you're going to fail from the first day. So set those goals and make a roadmap, and then do your best to implement, operationalize, have that technical assistance and deployment support, and then measure and report, and it's that rinse and repeat. And work with partners. I don't know any company or any clients or any municipal leaders that want to work with just one group. And I often say, if one company comes in and says they can do all of this for you, they're probably fibbing. We all need to work, and that's why I love the Smart Cities Council. Just a quick plug at the end, is that it's such an opportunity for you to meet other companies that you can partner with to do joint pursuits on. And at the end of the day, we want everyone to rise, and if we can green and improve and lift up one city at a time, I think we're in good space.